All right. Thank you, Astrid, and thank you to CRC for inviting me today. It's great to be here. I love first annual women's conferences because that is a beginning, right? It always starts with the first step, and then you never know what you can accomplish. So, we're going to talk about a lot today over the next 90 minutes. I'm going to share a lot of information with you. Hopefully your heads won't be spinning when you leave the room, but it's also going to be interactive, so you're going to play a part in this presentation, and hopefully it's engaging and fun as well. All right, so as Astrid mentioned, I'm talking about the power of perception. Now, why did I title my talk The Power of Perception? This topic is based on my doctoral dissertation. So when I started my program in 2010, the statistics around women in leadership were first coming out. And when I saw the data, I was shocked, absolutely shocked, like most people are. But I was also intrigued about what was behind those numbers. Why is it that we have so many women in the middle getting experience, getting education, but we are not making it in large numbers to the leadership levels? So what I did is I studied all the barriers behind that. What keeps women from rising? In addition, I've always been fascinated by emotional intelligence. It's our people skills. So I wanted to know how that played into the perceptions of women and men in the workplace. So I studied that as well. So basically, I put all three of these topics together, and to my surprise, there's tremendous overlap with all of them. Leadership alone is extensively studied. Gender alone, extensively studied. Emotional intelligence alone. But together, there's a lot of overlap between those. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Perception impacts promotion. That's the bottom line. The reason we have a a global leadership gender gap, has nothing to do with women's skills, competencies, or knowledge. It has everything to do with our perceptions of women as leaders, as workers, as mothers, and as wives. It comes down to perception. And for many women, perception is reality, and it impacts promotion. So today we're going to talk about the leadership gender gap. I'm going to give you the latest statistics around that for your reference. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence. We'll talk about the barriers to leadership that I mentioned. We'll talk about gender culture, which is a piece that you don't hear a lot about. But I find most people are really not only interested, but surprised at how gender differences show up every day at home and at work. And then finally, I'm going to give you lots of practical strategies today that you can walk away with. Does that sound good? Yes. Yep. All right. So here's the latest statistics. Now, this is according to the Department of Labor. I've been tracking these numbers now for about 10 years. So women currently make up 47% of the workforce. So this is all occupations at all levels. This number has fluctuated. 5 years ago, women actually made up 57% of the workforce. So it fluctuates. It's nearly half now, but it does change. So looking at management and professional occupations. So this includes physician, attorney, so professional roles. Women make up just over half of all professional roles. As far as bachelor's degrees, women make up 60% of all bachelor's degrees in the US. That number has been pretty stable for a while. But what's also interesting is women also make up 60% of all bachelor's degrees in Europe also. So this is not just a US trend, this is a global trend. As far as board seats in the S&P 500, our largest organizations, women make up about a fifth, 21%. And the number that's really used as the main barometer for progress in leadership is the number of female CEOs. That number is currently at 5%. So you would think, given these other large numbers, women are in the workforce. They've been in the workforce. They have experience. They have education. There's a lot of women at entry level, and there's a lot of women in the middle. But as you look up the ladder, we see less and less women. Now, what's discouraging about these numbers? That 5% has not budged in 30 years. 30 years, we hover around 5% female CEOs. Last year, it was up to 5.2. The year before that, it was down to 4.7. So it fluctuates, but on average, over a 30-year period, it's about 5%. So For those math majors in the room, and I heard during the panel there's a couple of math majors in here, 5% of 500 is 25. So there are 25 trailblazing women who are CEOs of S&P 500 companies. This is just a partial list for your reference. You've heard these names: Mary Barra at GM, Ginny Rometty at IBM, Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, Adina Friedman at NASDAQ. So these women have been able to make it to the highest levels. Now, I have an image here from Greek mythology. Does anyone happen to know what this image is? I'm hearing whispers of it. Yes, Sisyphus. All right, this is an educated audience, I can tell. Sisyphus. So in Greek mythology, Sisyphus was punished by having to push a boulder up a mountain only to get it to the very top and have it roll back down again for eternity. So tasks that are both laborious and futile are referred to as Sisyphean. So there are days when I see women promoted into leadership roles and organizations initiating diversity and inclusion statistics, and I feel encouraged. And then I see the statistics. And I feel like we're starting all over again, and that boulder rolls right back down the hill. So the question is what we're doing futile? Is trying to reach gender parity in leadership futile? Can we make a change that impacts industry? Can we change the leadership ratios? Can we change how we envision a leader? The answer is yes, by one woman at a time. So every woman that advances in her career is a step up that mountain. So my recommendation is it's not futile, it's worth it, and it's progress, and it's baby steps. Okay, so let's talk a bit about emotional intelligence. So you've all heard about emotional intelligence, right? It's your people skills, essentially. I use this analogy of an iceberg because this has been around a long time. You may have seen IQ at the top and EQ, or emotional intelligence, at the bottom. And the implication there is that we have our intellectual intelligence, but our people skills really drives our behavior. That part is true. What's not true is emotional intelligence isn't hidden and under the waterline. Emotional intelligence is visible every single day in our behaviors, and we see it every single day at work. So here's the formal definition. It's how we perceive and express ourselves. So it's a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how we express ourselves, how we develop and maintain our relationships, how we cope with challenges and make decisions, and finally, how we use that information to guide our thinking and action. So that's the formal definition of emotional intelligence. So I have a question for you. I mentioned this is going to be interactive. Let's see a show of hands. How many of you think men are more emotionally intelligent than women? It's okay. Be honest. Be candid. All right, let's see a show of hands. How many of you think men are more emotionally intelligent than women? Not one person in the room. Not even the men? Okay. Now, I bet some of the men are scared because this is a female-dominated audience, but it's okay. It's okay. Does anyone think men are more emotionally intelligent? No. Okay. I have never had an audience where there wasn't one person, at least, who thought that. Okay. So how many of you think women are more emotionally intelligent than men? Let's see a show of hands. Okay. 100% of the room. You're all wrong. And millions of people who's taken emotional intelligence assessments worldwide, men and women are actually equally emotionally intelligent overall. However, you knew there's a however coming, right? However, we do have different emotional intelligence strengths that are considered gender specific. So let's take a look at those. In general, women tend to score higher than men in areas of empathy, social responsibility. You can think of that also as corporate social responsibility, and interpersonal relationships. So on average, men tend to score higher than women in areas of assertiveness, stress tolerance, and self-regard. What's another name for self-regard? Yes, confidence. Men score higher in confidence. than women do. Now, caveat, not all of us fall into gender-specific patterns. There are many women who are stronger in the male-specific attributes, and there are many men who are stronger in those female-specific EQ attributes. But when you look at overall trends globally, this is how it falls out from a gender-specific pattern. So I was really interested in this because I wanted to know how these EQ differences played into the perception and promotion of women. So let's take a look. So the women that I interviewed in my research, and also that I interviewed for the book, shared with me that if they were naturally empathetic and they were in a leadership role, that they were viewed as lacking substance and lacking intelligence if they were highly empathetic. Now, do you think that's correct? Can you be empathetic and have substance and intelligence at the same time? Of course you can. We all know that, right? It even sounds absurd saying it. But that is the perception. So somehow being empathetic and being analytical are viewed as mutually exclusive. These women who are also high in those female attributes shared with me that they were told to, they shared with me that when they expressed emotions at work, they had some negative reactions. So one vice president that I interviewed in particular shared with me during a work performance review, she sat down with her boss, and they were talking through a really tough issue that she was having with the direct report, and she started crying during the discussion. So they worked through it, they talked through it, and it was over that meeting ended, and then she started noticing that she wasn't getting the special opportunities and projects anymore that she used to get as a VP. She just wasn't getting the opportunities, and when it dawned on her, she was able to link it back to that situation with her boss where she cried. Now, I bring up this example for you because we all express emotions at work, right? Sorry. We all express emotions, but even today, our workplaces are not completely friendly and embracing of outward displays of emotions. So it's something, for women in particular, something just to be mindful of and to keep in check. What emotions do we generally see from men at work? Yes, I heard it over here. Anger. Anger would be. Well, we see a range of emotions from men and women, but crying at work for women is, women often have a negative feedback from that, and then outward lashes of anger from men as well. So we are emotional creatures. We're not robots. We should express our emotions at work, and we need to work together to have workplaces that are more embracing of emotions. So that's what women shared with me who were high in the EQ. So let's look at the other side of the coin. Women who are naturally higher in the male-specific attributes, so the confidence, the assertiveness, the stress tolerance. They shared with me that they weren't accepted as leaders because people expected an empathetic woman, right? So they were confident, they were assertive naturally, but then they heard comments that they weren't respected in their leadership role. I also heard comments from these women that were told to tone down their assertiveness and be more of a team player and be more social. So I can relate to this. I was raised to be confident, independent, and fiercely competitive. I thought that was the norm. I also grew up in a male-dominated industry. I am a female drummer. Yeah, see, are you a drummer too? Ish, a drummer-ish. I like that. So I grew up my whole life with comments like, she's just a girl, she won't be able to play very well. I heard, she's going to play too soft. I also heard she's not going to be able to get along with her male bandmates. Now, none of that turned out to be true. Those perceptions of me that I've encountered were all based on bias. It was based on their biases of what a female drummer might be. So I share that story with you because it makes it difficult for women when they reach a leadership level in their careers. It makes it difficult because there are opposing expectations. So whether you're strong in the female-specific EQ attributes or whether you're stronger in the male-specific EQ attributes, women experience resistance. So dual expectations often make it more difficult for women than for men in a leadership role. So that's based on bias. Okay, so let's talk about barriers to leadership. So I'll start with this image here. Can you all see that? People on the sides over there, on each side. So what I've done is in my research and in the book, I actually I looked at all the barriers. And there's a lot of them. There's different types of barriers, but I put them into categories. So this is one category of barriers: gender bias and gender stereotypes. And I'll explain agenic leader behaviors and role congruity in a minute. Okay, let's take a look at these stereotypes for a minute. Let's start with the female brain. We have a large region for chocolate. We have a pretty big shopping lobe. We have an area for musicals and sitcoms, fantasy, and maternal urges and weddings. Let's look at the male brain. You have one big area that stands out in the male brain. Surrounding that, you have a lame excuses gland, a beer lobe, job stuff, ball sports, and one commitment neuron. So I show you this. The problem with stereotypes, it's not that they're inaccurate. A lot of these things are true, right? I could relate to the chocolate one. I absolutely agree with that. Shopping, not so much, but chocolate, absolutely. But the thing with stereotypes is it doesn't account for individual differences and nuances. It's not all women like musicals and sitcoms. Not all men play sports or are interested in sports. So it's not that they're untrue, but it doesn't account for the individual differences. So that's the problem here. Agenic leader behaviors, what that is, so these are all rooted in bias, by the way. What agenic leader behaviors is, when you think of a leader, so let me ask you, when you think of a leader, just what comes to mind right away? Name some characteristics for me. Assertive? Was that assertive? Okay. What was that?
A good listener.
A good listener. Okay.
Well put together.
Well put together.
Confident.
I like that. Confident. What else? When you think of a leader?
Intelligent.
Intelligent. Okay. Hopefully. Okay, so decisive, right? Visionary. Good one. Compassionate. I don't always hear that one. And how about one more? Selfless. That's another one that I don't hear too often. So usually, so you guys have some great ones in there. Normally when we think of in terms of a leader, most people say competitive, confident, assertive, decisive. I hear that one a lot. Even aggressive sometimes, can handle stress. We don't hear empathetic. We don't hear someone who's great at relationships. We don't hear someone who's great at collaborating and teamwork. So when we think in leader terms, we often think male terms. We don't think female terms. That's a type of bias that most of us hold. And so we need to challenge our thinking around what a leader is. Especially today, given the diversity and inclusion, we're becoming more diverse every day as a global society. Our image and vision of what a leader is has changed. So we just have to be mindful of that bias. Role congruity theory, what that is, we have certain assumptions about behaviors that need to be shown to be successful in certain roles. I'll give you an example. A female leader in the military. A woman in the military can be a fantastic leader, but she may not be met positively by those that she leads or her platoon because she's in a role considered incongruent with being a female. Another example, let's take a male nurse. Again, a man can be a fantastic nurse, but he may not be met positively by those that he works with or the patients he cares for because he's in a role considered incongruent with a male. That's role congruity theory. Now, does it mean that we shouldn't go into occupations that are male dominated? Okay, this is a perfect question for you guys, right? It does not. If you are passionate about a certain industry, you absolutely should go for it. But you may be met with more resistance because of role congruity theory. So my advice is to ignore what people say and just keep plugging away. and follow your passions. So that's one category of barriers. Let's look at the next category. This is called structural obstacles. So this includes lack of access to lack of access to informal networks. What do you think? So give me a type of informal network. Golf. I heard golf. Yes. Getting together with golf. Getting folks together maybe after work or maybe taking a client out. What's another example of an informal network? Happy hour. Excellent. Drinks after work.
Fantasy football league.
Fantasy. That's a great one. Great one. No one's ever brought that up, but it's a fantastic example of workplace informal network. Now, there's a term for these informal networks that's been around for a while. What do you think that could be? Yes, the Good Old Boys Network. Now, I'm bringing this up because informal networks are critically important. So think about this. If you're on the golf course or you're having drinks or dinner or any sporting event with your coworkers or clients, you're in a relaxed setting, right? You let your guard down. You share personal information about yourself. You get intel about the company and maybe the industry in general. And most importantly, you're building relationships. Now, today, many women still don't have access to these informal networks. So these are alive and well today. And it's an important component of a barrier. So I'll give you an example. In the pharmaceutical industry, there was a company that had a meeting in Manhattan last year. And they had a free evening. And so a group of the men got together and said, hey, let's go catch the basketball game at Madison Square Garden. So a big group of guys did that, and they went to the game. Well, a large group of the women were left at the hotel saying, well, what are we going to do? So they decided to get together and go have a nice dinner. So the next morning, these groups were sharing what they did the night before with each other. And one of the men asked the women, he says, why didn't you invite us to dinner? And she looked at him puzzled and said, why didn't you invite us to the game? That is a real example of how we simply aren't inclusive in our behaviors. Now, there are many women who would have loved to go to the game and see the basketball game. Some wouldn't, and that's okay. But many probably would have loved it. And there would have been a group of guys who may have loved to go to dinner. So we just have to think about our behaviors and make sure we're inclusive, especially with those informal networks. Lack of female role models. You've all heard this one. Now this one, it's still important. And the reason it's important is because when you look at the top and you don't see someone who looks like you, it can not only be discouraging, but it's hard to see a path to success. So that's why it's critically important that we have more women who are in leadership roles take a role model lead. Lack of female mentors. We still need more women to mentor junior colleagues. What the data shows is that women tend to be so encumbered with their daily activities that they don't take the time to mentor their junior colleagues. Men actually are much better at this than women are. Men will put their arm around a junior colleague and say, come on, I'll show you the ropes. Women tend not to do this as much with other women. There's no reason we can't, it's just we get caught up in our daily activities. But it's really important to continue to mentor our junior colleagues. And the last one is male sponsors. So I heard this on the panel, and I thought it was a great topic that a few of you brought up. So the difference between a mentor and a sponsor is a mentor helps you in your current role. They help you develop and they help you improve in that role. A sponsor helps you get to the next role. So a sponsor serves on your behalf as an advocate to help you move to that next level. Now, why is it important for women to have male sponsors in particular? Why would you guess? More access?
They have more access to the upper echelons, I suppose, because there's more men.
Yeah, exactly. So she said they have more access to the upper levels, upper echelons. So 2 reasons. One, there are many more men in decision-making positions of power than there are women. The other reason is optics. So picture a high-level meeting, closed-door meeting, and they're talking about succession planning. If Jane speaks up, so let's say Jane's a vice president. If Jane speaks up and says, I think Susan should be promoted, Susan's fantastic. that may not carry a lot of weight because the perception may be that she's just supporting her because she's another woman. If Bob speaks up in that same meeting and says, I think Susan should be promoted, Susan's fantastic, oftentimes that will carry more credibility. So for those reasons, it's critically important that women seek male sponsors. Now, as far as mentors, it's great to have a mix of men and women because you get different perspectives. Men and women think differently and they behave differently. So I would highly encourage you to have a variety in your mentorship network. But sponsors, if you could seek out some male sponsors to help you along the way, that would help significantly for advancing. The third category is individual mindset. So a large percentage of women hold themselves back for different reasons. Now, it could be lack of confidence or assertiveness. Sure, that could be a reason for some women, but not all women. The women that I interviewed, I often heard that women looked at the top and saw the politics and said, I don't want any part of that. And I heard that echoed again and again. So women often value work-life balance more than men. Men are willing to sacrifice in their careers and just climb the ladder and do what's needed to succeed. Not all women are willing to do that, and that's okay. We often want different things. So for different reasons, women self-select out of the workforce and hold themselves back. What the data shows is that women tend to get to the director level and they tend to settle in there, or they self-select out. A small percentage actually go on to vice president, president, and the C-suite. Fortunately, we are seeing more women, though, moving on. And then the last barrier within this category is office housework. What do you think office housework might be?
Break room, ordering.
Okay, keeping the break room orderly, you said? Okay.
Ordering lunch.
Ordering lunch. Cleaning up after lunch. What was that? Note taker, good one. Planning parties, excellent. This is a good group. Anything else come to mind for you, what office housework might mean? How about bringing the donuts? Or today I should say gluten-free bagels. Probably not the donuts. So all of these activities are critical to keep a company running smoothly. And every company needs this. But the issue with these types of activities is they're behind the scenes and they're time consuming. Women make up about 95% of these types of activities. Now, women volunteer for these activities. Why do we do this? What was that?
Expectations.
Oh, expectations. Oh, a good one. Yes, absolutely. That's part of the reason, expectations. We're raised that way. That's how we're socialized.
It's to fulfill that brain lobe that you had on there, the maternal and whatever.
to be consistent with our brain wiring. Yes. What was that?
Because they know the men won't do it.
Okay, good. Those are excellent. Excellent. Also, the other piece is women want to be helpful. They want to be helpful. So that's a good thing. But again, the issue here is they're behind the scenes, they are time consuming, and they often don't get recognized by leadership. So here's my recommendation for you. If you are a woman who tends to volunteer for these types of activities, don't always raise your hand first. Let other people have an opportunity. Now, I know you are the best one to do it, and you can do it better than anyone else. I know you're thinking that. And it's probably true. It's probably true. But allow others to have an opportunity. Here's the other key piece. If you are in charge of planning these events, don't ask for volunteers. Because 90% of the volunteers will be women. Assign roles. Assign roles. Jim can bring the donuts or the bagels at the next meeting. Mary can help plan it and set up. Bob can be the note taker. So assign roles to you, ensure a gender mix. This is a really important point, and it may sound trivial, but these types of activities are so time consuming. Even what's also included in here is mentoring new hires. New hires need a lot of help. They need a lot of guidance, and women are often the ones who take the time and spend extra hours with that new hire. So I would encourage you all to volunteer for these activities. Again, they're needed to keep an organization moving, and to don't just rely on the women to always step up to do that. Men tend to volunteer for activities that are more visible, such as optional meetings or sitting on cross-functional teams. So it's in keeping with gender stereotypes, and so that's why I have put this in the individual mindset category. Now, finally, the other category is lifestyle choices. This is work-life balance, family choices, and breadwinner caregiver roles. So let's talk about this for a minute. Today's households, majority of households are dual income or single parent households. We don't see as many households nowadays where you have one parent working, one parent staying at home. Most times both parents work today. If a woman is the primary breadwinner of her household, she's usually the primary caregiver as well. If a man is a primary breadwinner of his household, he's rarely the primary caregiver. Now, this is a key distinction. Even among millennial women, we still are seeing this. So the reality is if you have the lion's share of the child care and the household duties, the grocery shopping, the laundry, doing the dishes, the cooking, the cleaning, you're doing that and you're trying to manage a career full time, it's difficult. It's very difficult for anybody. Even if you're Superman or Superwoman, it's difficult for anybody to be successful at everything. So we have to make choices and we have to make sacrifices. So I would recommend here is to have the discussion with your partner or your spouse. Now, I was surprised because when I interviewed women about this, many women said, I never had the discussion with my husband. So what do you mean you never had this discussion? Isn't this a big decision you have to make? What are you going to do with your careers when you have a family? A lot of times the discussion never occurred because the assumption was she would just be the one to do it. So I encourage you today, in the 21st century, we are forward-thinking, we are evolved, right? I would encourage you to have that discussion with your partner. I've heard some great examples about how couples they've traded off. So for example, let's say a woman takes a break from her career and takes time off to raise the children while they're young. Then when they get old enough, then she got a promotion and he took a step down in his career and they relocated for her job. That's a great example of trading off. So there's lots of things you can do. But the reality is the more parity we have at home, the more parity we will have at work. So I spend a lot of time on this one because it's a really important decision, and we should be having those conversations. Okay, now we're going to get into a group activity here because I would love to hear from you all as far as your experiences. Is there any questions on anything I've covered so far? No? Clear as mud? Okay, let's get into an activity. So I was going to ask you to get into groups for 8 or 10, but you're already there. You're already in your groups, which is perfect. Have you personally experienced any of these barriers? Anything we've talked about? I know I just gave you a lot of information. Have you personally experienced any of these barriers yourself? And if so, what was the result of that? So let's take about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, and then just share at your tables, and then I'll hear from a few groups, and we'll talk about that. For that. Thank you. Adults learn from each other, oftentimes. And I think someone on the panel mentioned that we learn on the job. I think it was actually the woman who was just speaking who said that, if I recall. Yes, we absolutely learn on the job, but we learn from each other. So hearing each other's stories is empowering. So, gender culture. Actually, this is, the more I talk about this, turning into one of my favorite subjects because it's fascinating. It's fascinating to sit back and watch how this all plays out, and we live this every day. I think this next slide just sums up gender perfectly. Now, for those over here who can't see the slide, the mission is to go to Gap and buy a pair of pants. As you can see, the male's the blue line, the female's the red line. In 6 minutes, $33 later, man has his pants. Mission accomplished. The woman meanders around the entire mall, stopping at most of the stores. 3.5 hours later, over $800, she has those same pants. So this is just a whimsical look at gender differences. Let's take a more serious look at how this shows up in the workplace. Men and women are raised in different cultures. That culture starts at birth, and we carry that into the workplace as adults. This is not about rights and wrongs. It's simply about differences. Because of how we're hardwired differently and how we're socialized differently, we approach virtually every aspect of business differently. How we work within an organizational structure, how we conduct meetings, how we network, how we interpret information, how we communicate, work in teams, collaborate, solve problems, and finally, how we lead. Virtually every aspect of business is different. It's precisely these differences why we need gender balanced leadership, because we think and behave differently. And there's lots of data behind this. I believe your morning keynote speaker touched to some of this. There's lots of data behind diversity and inclusion and all the good things that can come of that. But let's look at how gender differences play out in the workplace. What are the games boys play? Feel free to shout it out. G.I. Joe. What was that? What night? Fortnite? Video game. What else do boys play? Cars. Trains. Football. Cops and robbers. Soldiers. So military games, video games, car games, sports. Anything else? So the lessons that boys learn very early in these games is that competition and they're taught lessons around winning and losing and competition. So boys get a lot of valuable lessons in these games. Boys learn how to play with people on the team that they may not necessarily like. They learn that when the game is over, you're friends again. Even though you claw each other's eyes out during the game, you're friends again. Go have hot dogs and pizza afterwards. Boys are also taught about hierarchy. There's a pecking order in life, work in life. So if you think about a team, there is the coach, there's a star player, there's your above average player, there's your average player, and there's your bench warmer. There's a pecking order. The lessons boys learn very early is about win and lose and competition. Let's look at the games girls play. Feel free to shout them out. Dolls. House. Mommy. Playing mommy. That's part of house, I would think. Someone said something over here? Tea parties. Yes. Does someone say cleaning? Really? Are we really practicing cleaning as a 10-year-old? What other games do girls play? What was that? Store? Makeovers? Actually, animal games, dancing and singing games. Okay, the lessons that girls are taught very early, very young, is that it's about the process. It's not about winning and losing. It's about the process of play. Girls are also taught that, remember the power even distribution? So girls are raised in a flat culture. They're taught that I am the same as you, you're the same as her, she's the same as her. Even power distribution, not the hierarchy. So girls also learn collaboration skills, teamwork, and communication skills in these games. So these are key lessons that girls are taught, very different than what the boys are taught. Let me ask you this. Have you ever lost at a game of Barbies? Has anyone ever lost at a game of Barbies? If you have, you're a really bad Barbie player. You can't lose. It's not possible because it's about the process. It's all about the process of play. And girls can play for hours and hours, right? It's about process. Okay, how do we take these lessons into work? I'll give you some examples here. When it comes to meetings, men tend to line their ducks up in a row before the meeting actually happens. They meet with the key players, they talk about key issues, and they address any potential concerns. Why do men do this? Remember hierarchy. It's about status, maintaining status in the pecking order. Now, what I'm talking about here, it happens at a subconscious level. We're not consciously thinking, I'm going to have a meeting before the meeting because I'm going to maintain status in the hierarchy. Men aren't thinking that, and neither are women. But we do this because this is how we're socialized, constantly reinforced by society, by our parents, by our teachers, by movies, by the TV shows, by the books we read. So men line their ducks up in a row before the meeting. So when the meeting occurs, the actual meeting on the calendar, it's really already happened. Now, in the female culture, this doesn't make any sense. Women don't do this. What a woman does is she goes to the meeting with all her great ideas ready to dialogue with everyone else at the meeting. Unbeknownst to her, the meeting's really already occurred. Okay. So, remember, I'm not talking not about rights and wrongs. These are just simply differences according to our gender culture. So, at the meeting, we also conduct ourselves differently. Men tend to speak in a declamatory voice with authority. They tend to interrupt others more, and they tend to resist being influenced in public. Again, it's about maintaining status in that hierarchy. Women tend to wait their turn, nod, and smile more in meetings. Watch this the next time you're in a meeting. Watch these behaviors. Now, I bring this up because it's about perceptions, right? In this picture here, if you have a man standing up, he's talking in a declamatory voice, he sure sounds authoritative, he sure sounds like a leader. And if a woman is sitting back and raising her hand and waiting her turn, what's the possible perception? The perception is that he looks more like a leader than she does. So I want you to be aware of these behaviors. Let's take another example. We have differences in how we communicate. So let's start with successes and failures. When it comes to success, men tend to point inward and say, I worked really hard on this project, put in a lot of time, and I did it. When it comes to failure, men tend to point outward, saying, I wasn't that into it, didn't have enough time, or pointing to external factors. So success and failure is very different. Women, just the opposite. When it comes to success, women tend to point outward, giving credit to their team, saying, I had a great team, I got lucky, or it was good timing. When it comes to failure, where do you think women point? Inward. Just the opposite. Even if it's not their fault. Women tend to take the blame even if it's not their fault. So I think we can learn from each other here. Men could learn from women and give more credit to other people. Women can learn from men and take more credit for your successes and own your successes. We also have differences in how we listen. So I find this one fascinating. If you watch a man and a woman in a conversation, a man will sit there and he will usually only nod when he agrees with what's being said. Women are very different. Women tend to nod during the whole conversation. Now, I could relate to this because I'm a nodder. I'm constantly nodding when I'm talking to people, no matter who it is. I'm nodding. What women are saying to the speaker is, I hear you, keep going. It doesn't mean she is agreeing with what's being said. So oftentimes we miss each other from a communication standpoint, because if you're in a meeting with a male colleague and the woman is nodding the whole time, let's say most of the time, after the meeting, he's going to assume that she was on board and agreed with everything that was said. Oftentimes that's not the case. So when she comes back and questions something, he sees it as insubordination. It's not insubordination. She's simply questioning it because she wasn't agreeing, but the perception is he perceived her as agreeing. Do you guys follow that?
Sometimes women even say right, like you're acknowledging that you're hearing, and you say right, I
Yes.
hear you, rather than
Yes.
no, I don't agree.
Excellent. So we give verbal clues and nonverbal clues to the speaker. Now we do this. Remember the key lesson that girls learn? Relationships. Number one thing. Relationships are the most important thing. So we are telling the speaker, go ahead. Okay, what's the possible perceptions of these behaviors? If a man is sitting there, stoic, he nods once or twice, he will likely be perceived as decisive. If a woman is nodding the whole time, she may be perceived as indecisive. Again, perceptions are powerful. Finally, networking. We network differently. And I heard this alluded to on the panel, so I wanted to bring it up. If you work in an office environment, men tend to walk the floor and will message what they're doing consistently to their superiors. They'll pop in their boss's office, chit-chat, catch up on the latest gossip, and talk about what they're doing. In a very subtle way, very casual, comfortable way. Women, in sharp contrast, stay in their offices, working away on their computers, doing great work, hoping to be noticed. What's the possible result 3 months down the line when the hiring manager has an opening on his or her team? Who do they think of? The person who's been in their office 7 times, and that's usually the male. So we network differently. What's interesting about this is men in the workplace are better networkers because they've been taught to network their entire lives. But women actually have larger networks. So if women just leveraged their vast networks, that would go a long way. If you reached out more often to your colleagues or your acquaintances and said, hey, just want to touch base, how you doing? I'm working on this, how can I help you? That would go a long way. Okay, that's communication. Let's look at leadership. So there's lots of different leadership styles out there. Here are 2 of the most common: transactional leadership and transformational leadership. Transactional leadership is an even exchange of transactions between leader and follower. I do this for you if you do this for me. An example is, let's say a male boss says to his junior colleague, John, you work really hard on this project, give me 110%, and I'll make sure you get the next promotion. That's an example of transactional leadership. It's very common in business and politics. It's also associated with men. It's a male style of leadership. Now, transformational leadership is it's a type of leadership where the leader and follower, you have more even controls. You have collective problem solving, collective decision making. Transformational leadership is also built on ethics, values, emotions, and long-term goals. Women are naturally transformational leaders. So we can all become better transformational leaders, men and women, by leveraging your empathy, your listening skills, your communication, your collaboration skills. That will help you be a better transformational leader. And lots of data, has been lots of studies about transformational leadership. It's shown that in today's contemporary global high-paced organizations, transformational leadership is the type of leadership style we need. All right, let's move on. Any questions so far on gender differences? All right, so this sums it up. What's the take-home? The take-home is these different gendered behaviors cause very different perceptions by our leaders and our coworkers, but have a very real impact on promotion, especially for women. Okay, you ready for some strategies? What can we do about all this now? So I would encourage you to take notes if you're interested, or you could take pictures of the slides. I'm going to give you 3 strategies for every barrier we've talked about today. First of all, gender culture, the topic we just touched on. Here are 3 suggestions for you. Reinterpret the opposite gender's intent. If you ever scratch your head and say, why does he do that? Or why is she doing that? If the opposite gender is acting in a way that makes no sense to you, they are likely acting in a way that's consistent with their gender culture. So what we need to do is recognize that and just reinterpret their behavior. It may make no sense in the male or female culture, but in their culture, it's perfectly appropriate. Second thing, flex your style by modifying your behavior to be in sync with the other person's gender culture. So flex and adapt, and there was a great example given at the table over here about doing that. The third suggestion, talk about the differences and the best ways to work together. That's probably the best thing you can do. If there's an elephant in the middle of the room, talk about it. You could say, hey, Mike, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye in the past. How can we work together in a way that mutually supports each other? Just something as simple as that to help get the conversation going. So those are 3 suggestions for gender culture. As far as the institutional mindsets, here are a few suggestions for you. Be honest with yourself about biases. We are all biased. Every single one of us, based on our upbringing, our background, our values, and what we've been taught. So be honest with yourself about biases you may hold. The more you can make decisions collectively, the better. That helps take bias out of the process. So there's a saying. It's easier to take bias out of process than it is out of people. And that's very true. So make decisions collectively will help take the biases out. That could be decisions in hiring. It could be promotion decisions. It could be budget decisions, succession planning decisions. So anytime you can make them collectively will help. And finally, don't make assumptions that women are limited in their commitment, travel, or ability to take a new assignment if they have children at home. I heard this quite a bit, that if a woman is pregnant or has small children at home, she would be passed over for an assignment because the assumption is she has small children, she won't be able to travel. She won't want to do it. The women I interviewed actually was just the opposite. They said they wanted the opportunity. They wanted a break. Please give me that special assignment. So now, caveat with this one, this doesn't apply just to women. It also applies to men. Not all men want to travel 5 days a week, every week, right? There's plenty of men who would prefer not to travel so much. So the bottom line here is don't make assumptions about anybody. Make sure you're asking your team what they want and what their preferences are. Okay, the next category, structural strategies. Seek mentors and sponsors and develop reciprocal relationships. Oftentimes, mentors and sponsors get as much out of the relationship as you do. And it's often, as I mentioned, it's often reciprocal. So make sure you're seeking the vast network and make sure you have a good diversity of men and women. Cultivate and leverage your network. I've touched on that one, especially for women. And be inclusive in all your behaviors. And that's going back to the example with the pharmaceutical company. Just make sure you're being inclusive and you're not excluding. The saying is, if you're not actively including, you're probably unintentionally excluding. So if you're not actively being inclusive about your behaviors, you're likely unintentionally excluding somebody or some group. As far as individual strategies, take on new challenges and take risks. There is a difference in risk-taking between men and women. Women tend to ruminate much more than men do. Women will think things through and think of long term and think about all the different factors. And so it takes women sometimes longer to make a decision, but oftentimes it's an accurate decision because they've taken that time up front. But sometimes this rumination keeps us from taking risks. So I would encourage you to take those new challenges and responsibilities. And someone on the panel said it, say yes. Who was that? Is he still in the room? Yes, I love that. I love that. Actually, an example I give in the book is when it comes to TED Talks, there's a TED organizer, and he was looking for speakers for TED Global. He approached 10 men. All 10 men said, yes, I'll do the TED Talk. He approached 10 women, and 9 out of the 10 women said no. That's a true story. Why is that? So we often don't say yes. We don't take the risks we should. Because if you take a risk and you don't like it, you've learned something. If you take a risk and you fail, you've learned something. So I would encourage you to take those new challenges on. For women, take credit for your successes more and speak confidently and speak often. Don't be afraid to ask for what you want. And there was a table that mentioned that beautifully. As far as lifestyle strategies, have an honest dialogue with your employer about your needs, your work-life balance needs. So today's organizations, with the influx of millennials and Generation Z behind them, our HR departments are scrambling to keep up and meet the needs of these new generations. This is very good news for all of us, especially for women. So millennials value work-life balance more than older generations had in the past. They also are demanding flexibility, part-time assignments, work-from-home assignments. So if you have these needs, don't be afraid to share this with your employer, because employers are listening now. Have an honest dialogue with your spouse or partner about breadwinner and caregiver issues. Again, that's a critical decision and a critical discussion that should be had. And finally, role modeling equity at home is the last suggestion here. There's really interesting data behind this one, is that when daughters see dad helping out around the house, doing the dishes, doing the laundry perhaps, those daughters tend to go into occupations that are less stereotypically female. There's actually robust data behind that. So when your kids are watching, when kids see parity at home, that gets reflected in their career choices. So that's powerful. Okay, men. We have a large percentage of men in the room. What, maybe 75 men in the room? Okay, I'm going to speak specifically to you here. We need your help. We are not going to get anywhere close to gender parity without men on board. Actually, we will not achieve it. We will not achieve it without your help. We need men to actively hire women, mentor, sponsor women, coach women, support women, include women, develop women, listen to, and promote women actively. We also need men to commit to changing the leadership ratios. We would ask that men commit to diversity and inclusion. And finally, commit to fairness. I find with men, the vast majority of men, the reason we have a leadership gender gap is not men's fault. And it's not women's fault. It's actually a little both. But we can't point the fingers either way. I find with the vast majority of men are simply unaware of these behaviors and these barriers that women experience, that all of you have shared today. So committing to a sense of fairness and diversity, having your teams more diverse and inclusive goes a long way. Now, if you do this, here is all the benefits that you will reap. There's a long list. Better listeners, more empathetic, more self-aware, enhanced interpersonal skills. I think that was touched on during the panel. You'll have larger networks, new perspectives. You'll be viewed as a valued rainmaker in your industry and in your company. Respected by your peers, you'll be a more effective leader. You'll help your organization's bottom line. And the last one, it's a lofty goal, but be better husbands and fathers. So we need men. We have to have men on board. All right. Any questions or comments about that? That's the first time I've ever shared that slide. I actually made that slide for you guys, specifically for this talk. So hopefully that resonates. Okay, and finally, I'd like to share a personal story with you. The story behind this picture. That is me getting my undergraduate degree at UC Irvine. But getting to that point was difficult. So for me, high school was pretty easy for me, so I didn't develop the steady habits that I needed. I actually grew up in Fresno, by the way. So I've done the 99 trail quite a bit growing up in college. So born and raised in Fresno, went to Clovis West High School. I didn't develop the steady habits I should have. So I come to UCI as an undergraduate, pre-med major of all things, and my grades started tanking. The classes were a lot harder than I thought. There were 200 people in the audience. I barely knew the professors, if at all, and it was way more work than I anticipated. So I think my first year, I had maybe a C average, C plus average. So I was put on academic probation. The second year, it got worse. Even being on academic probation, it got worse. Failed calculus a few times, failed chemistry. I hated statistics. So I ended up having, I think finally at that point, I think I had like a D plus average. So at the end of my second year, I met with my academic counselor. And he, sitting in front of me, looked at my transcripts, and he looked me in the eye and said, "Sean, I recommend you take some time off." In translation, what he was saying is, I need to leave the university. So I took that advice. I went to the park. If any of you are familiar with UC Irvine, there's a park in the center. It's a circular park called Aldridge Park. I remember sitting in the middle of this park crying, thinking, I just got kicked out of the university. I just got kicked out. So I had to withdraw from my classes, say goodbye to my friends, and leave the university. Now, I did take time off. I took 2 years off. In that 2 years, well, first of all, let me say that was devastating, first of all, to be kicked out, because I didn't think it would even get close to that. I thought I'd get my grades up and no problem. So in those 2 years, I had to do some soul searching. And I had to get serious about what I really wanted and learn about who I really was. So in those 2 years, I joined a band as a drummer, joined my first band. I got my EMT license and started working at emergency rooms and hospitals. And the third thing I did was take classes at junior colleges to get my GPA back up. And I loved all of that. So after 2 years, I was readmitted back to UCI. I changed my major to psychology, and I happily graduated. Fast forward 20 years later, that is me getting my doctorate degree from Pepperdine University after being kicked out of college. So I share the story with you because it's a story about lows and highs, but it was a turning point in my life. The story is mostly about perseverance, though. So as we've talked about today, we all have setbacks in our lives and our careers. It's about perseverance. It's about pushing that boulder up the mountain. So I want to leave you with this. Be encouraged. Women are slowly making gains. Slowly, but we're getting there. Be persistent. Don't give up on your aspirations, whatever those may be in your career. And finally, speak up for what you really care about. And it's going to vary for each of you. And with that, I encourage you to connect with me on social if you're interested in these topics and keeping up to date. And I also have a free 25-page Power Perception workbook on my website that you can download, and that it follows each chapter in the book that you have. So it's a workbook built around each chapter in the book. With that, I thank you very much. You've been a great audience today. Thank you.